Well, good afternoon, everybody. And Cynthia, welcome and thank you for your time today. Great to see you again.
Thanks for having me on the show, Jackie.
It's a great to catch up with you. I've been running this series of author interviews now for over a year or so, but this is my first LinkedIn Live. So we have the wonderful Donna in the background making sure all the back end works. And so if there are any hiccups, they're totally my responsibility. So for today, as mentioned, I'm going to be having a discussion with Cynthia about the two books that she has written and self-published, why she chose to write and self-publish her books, what worked, what didn't, and what she can tell us about the ongoing process. But before we get into that, I'd like to share a bit of background about Cynthia. Cynthia and I have known each other, I don't know, maybe Cynthia for 20 odd years, I think now. And I think we first met when you were the CEO of the Arab Australia Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
That's right, yeah.
And at that time, I was undertaking a series of business books in the Middle East, and Cynthia was a key point person that I had to engage. So, and we hit it off immediately and later developed an initiative to increase the awareness of business women in the Middle East. And that was called the Australian Arab Businesswomen's Forum. So we had a couple of really great sojourns on that one, didn't we, Cynthia?
You did, including a trip to the Middle East.
Yes, and maybe if we have time later, you might tell people about my little escapade at Qatar Airport, where I almost didn't make it out of the airport because I had a contretemps with the passport lady. But anyway,
I tried to block that one out.
Cynthia has founded and continues to run an international business growth consultancy now called Dearin and Associates. Through this business, Cynthia helps Australian businesses expand internationally. As part of her business marketing and brand building and visibility, Cynthia has written and published two books. The first one, Cynthia, you might want to hold this up, is Camels, Sheiks and Billionaires. There you go, great book, and is a starter guide to establishing and running a business in the Middle East. Her second book, which I've got here we go, is called Business Beyond Borders, Taking Your Company Global. And it takes a broader view of how to establish, grow and operate a business in other key international markets. So Cynthia's a two-book expert at this stage. Before we get into your experience of books, Cynthia, perhaps you can let us know what you're currently working on in Dearin and Associates.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jackie. That's a great question. So Dearin and Associates, as it exists today, is there to help companies, particularly manufacturers, to go global. And my team and I do that by helping companies to create and then execute international strategies that make sense. So that is what it is. We have a couple of ways that we do that. We either work with clients one-on-one, that's usually our bigger clients, and then we run a number of group programs. We have a year-long accelerator program and then an 8-week program for people who are just getting started out in that international export space, who want to just design an export plan that they can take and execute. So depending on where you are on the journey and how big you are, there are a few different ways that we like to work with clients.
Wow, and I can imagine for businesses, small and big, taking that kind of first initial steps to go international can be pretty scary. So knowing your background, I'm sure that that's a great help. So now let's get into the book part of this discussion. Your first book, Camels, Sheiks and Billionaires, which by the way is just such a fantastic title, was a highly targeted book in terms of the potential audience. What was the motivating factor for you to write and then publish the book? And what's the difference between thinking about it and actually deciding to do it?
Well, look, it's really interesting. So I wrote Camels, Sheiks and Billionaires not long after I'd started Dearin and Associates. So I started on that project in 2014. So I started the company in 2013 and I began to write the book halfway through 2014. And at that time, when I started out, I had just come off the back of 10 years of complete Middle East focus. So I'd been working internationally, doing this internationally focused work, but most of it was in the Middle East. So I'd worked in Egypt as an Australian diplomat, and then in the UAE and Qatar also as a diplomat. I'd gone off and done a Master of Middle East Politics. I'd then been a management consultant for the British and US governments, working on different economic aspects throughout the Middle East. And then I'd come back and run the Australian Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So I was soaked in the Middle East. And when I started the company, I kind of couldn't get Middle East out of my head because I'd been doing it for so long. And so when I started the business, it was all about the Middle East. That was what we were doing. And because basically most people in Australia at that point in time, to a lesser degree now, but especially then, really didn't know that much about the Middle East. They just thought it was people with Kalashnikovs jumping out of bed and running down the street. They didn't know about all the other opportunities there. So I really wrote the book to explain to people what the Middle East was like, how you could effectively do business there, and also really to create some profile and credibility for myself as an advisor in that Middle East space. The difference between thinking about it and doing it, I have to say, in all honesty, there really was not very much. So because I'd been I like to write for a start, right? So the writing part is not difficult for me, but I'd been doing Middle East for so long that when I sat down to write it, I set myself a target of doing 1,000 words a day over 30 days. And it took me 45 days to get a first draft done. And so I actually powered through that, in a couple of months' time, and then had something that I could send off to an editor. So just if you want to do a bit of a compare and contrast between that and the second book, the first book I had no kids and plenty of spare time, and I blasted through it in 2 months. And the next book took me 4 years to write in total. I wrote 3 chapters before the second child was born and after the first child was born. And then the other 13 chapters got written in 4 months, several years later, when I wasn't completely sleep deprived. So it was a totally different experience for each one. No lack of motivation. Children have a lot to answer for.
Maybe they get to read your books when they're a bit older. So I guess and tell me, this is a question that I'm often asked. Everyone focuses on writing their book. And so how long is that period between when you finished your first draft to when you actually got your book in your hands, and both times? And was the time frame different for either book?
I'm trying to remember. With the first book, so they were also done a little bit differently. So I think, if memory serves, on the first book, I began the manuscript in May or June, and I finished it. If I started in May, I finished in July, and if I started in June, I finished in August. So it was around that time frame. I then, put it through editing, and as you all know, that can take, a little bit of time. There's some back and forth and so forth. Then you work with your design team, and I have an amazing world's best designer who I met thanks to you, Jaqui, who has done the artwork and the cover and also the layout for both books. That is a lengthy process because Robin is amazing, and she's also a perfectionist, and so she wants things to be absolutely right, and she would send things back and forth pretty much till I wanted to kill myself, because that's not how my brain works, to get it exactly right. So that takes some time. And then for the first book, we decided to have it printed offshore, and so by the time I actually was holding a copy of the book in my hands, we had it printed, I think, up in Hong Kong. It was February the following year, so it's kind of May to February or June to February. The second book, completely different, because it took me much, much longer just to actually get it written. But in some ways that was faster. This was, in the middle of COVID. So I worked with the same editing and design team as I did for the first book. That was great. We knew each other really well by then. And I think that time the editing might have taken a bit longer because my editor had moved to London by that stage. So that slowed everything down. The design still took a lot of, back and forth, but the printing was much faster because we had it printed here in Sydney. And so when was it? It was January 2021. I started writing seriously, like the other 13 chapters that I'd put off since 2018 or 17. Wrote those from January to April. And then I had the book with me by July.
Wow. Okay. So yeah.
Very different.
And that's a really interesting insight. And I often say to people that, writing your book's one thing, but you've got to, depending on how fast you want to go, it might take you 6 to 8 months from your final draft to when you've actually got your book, depending on what you're doing and how you're printing it. So in your book, Business Beyond Borders, this one here, what are the 4 most important aspects of wanting to, take your business overseas that you cover in the book?
It's a tough question because, there are 16 chapters in there, right? If you had to I think if you had to pick out the top 4, you'd probably start with the 4 that are towards the start of the book. So you really have to work out what is the vision for it. A lot of people go into doing an international expansion in a very reactive or opportunistic way. And that is, in my view, entirely the wrong way to go about it. So I think you've got to get very clear on the rationale and what it's going to look like first. I think you need to get your market selection right. That's a huge mistake that people make quite frequently. They're trying to target multiple markets, or they pick a market at random or on gut feel, and it turns out to be the wrong one. Huge opportunity cost there. I think you have to really do your research. Again, it's got to all be structured and methodical, and you've got to be proceeding on the basis of evidence and data and not just what you hope to be true. So that would be a third one. And look, there are so many other ones I could pick on, but let me pick one that springs to mind, and that is make sure that you are across the cultural aspect and that you are really well equipped to work in a different culture, because people can get very cocky when they've had a degree of success at home and they think, oh, we have an awesome product, of course it will work somewhere else. Entirely forgetting that people have been living without their thing for, tens or maybe even hundreds of years. And just because they have a great product doesn't mean that everybody somewhere else is immediately going to say, oh, we need that. So, those would be 4 things that spring to mind for me that you really need to get across.
Yeah, and I think also, given our experience in the Middle East, people used to say to me, how can you do business in the Middle East, Jaqui? And I used to say, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, you're a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl. Can you do business there? And as you well know, the Middle East is not one big place. There's different cultural norms and acceptable behaviours and in different countries in the Middle East. So there's, understanding of the market you're going into, but also the cultural mores of the country, and they're very country specific. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, a few interesting stories that probably won't make this LinkedIn Live, I can tell you. So now coming back to your book, you self-published both of your books. Why did you choose that way to go as opposed to maybe trying to find a traditional publisher?
Look, a few reasons. I mean, one, traditional publishing is very, very slow. It's typically several years rather than several months to get a book out. If you put yourself in the hands of the publisher gets a lot of control with a book. And depending on the reasons that you write the book for, that might not be a problem. But I wrote each of my books for a very specific reason, and that was to promote my business and to set myself up as somebody with authority and somebody with credibility in the space, and also to give a lot of value to clients and partners and people who I hope to work with in the future. When you publish a book yourself, you get to retain the control. I mean, you obviously have the 100% responsibility for it succeeding or failing, but you get to have the say. So, you're not fighting anybody over the cover artwork or the quality of the paper or any of that kind of thing. And for me, each time you write a book, it's a really, really big project, but it's also something, it's lasting. It's going to be around for a long time. And so, I mean, Robin, my designer, and I would discuss this a lot. And she would always say, we have to make this absolutely the best that we can. We need to go for the best quality paper we can find. It's got to feel right in your hands. I mean, a level of detail that you would not ever think about if you just walked into a bookshop. But if you go to a bookshop and you do the exercise of picking up a few different books and flicking through, you'll see that lots of them are actually written on not great quality paper, that kind of thing. I mean, look, a lot of self-published books, you can tell when you pick them up and look at them, they look like they got printed at Officeworks, no margins and hardly any paragraphs. And you're like, oh, that's not, doesn't look so good to me. I wanted my book to be as good as I could make it. I was fortunate enough to work with very, very professional people, but I got to keep all the control and to decide, how long it was going to be, what was going to go in it, what cover art was going to be in it, how I'd promote it, how much I wanted to sell it for, whether I would sell it or give it away. I do both. Oh, while I think of it, Jackie, for anybody to say thanks for having me on the show, for anybody who is watching this now or later on a replay, I would like Jackie's Life to get as much exposure as possible. So if you would like a copy either of the Camel Sheiks book or of the book Jackie's holding, the Business Beyond Borders book, please write a comment of you can write which title you would like in the comments on the live, and we will look at them, and I will send you a copy of the book as a completely free gift, but I will only do it if you comment on Jackie's Life, so that Jackie gets
what a great thank you, Cynthia. I probably should have asked you to do that, but you did it for me anyway, and given it was my first one, I'll remember that. What marketing did you do for your book, and did you pre-launch? What marketing did you do before your book actually launched?
That is a good question. Now, with the first one, it's getting quite long in the past, right? So I'm trying to remember like what are exactly the details of what we did. I think, look, in a way, we probably I feel like we almost put more targeted effort into the first one. And that's partially because I had less things to do. But I mean, we set up a Facebook page for the book. We did a bunch of pre-launch email campaigns. I mean, to be honest, we did the same thing with the second book. We did pre-launch email campaigns. We did launches for both books. So, I did launches in Sydney and Melbourne for the first book. I planned launches.
I was at the one at Dimmock's in George Street.
And you were at the one at the Australia Arab Women's Forum that we did at lunch,
right.
Which was a really one of the best ones that I got to do. For the second book, it was as we were coming out of COVID, and I waited until last year. Actually, waited until 2022 to launch it because I didn't really want to have a launch on Zoom. I put so much work into it, and I'm like, I'm going to be sad if I have to launch my book on a Zoom call. Like I spend 90% of my working life on Zoom and in virtual platforms, and I'm like, I need to have a real event. We had about 100 people registered to come to the Sydney one. Unfortunately, the Melbourne one, we ended up having to cancel because people in Melbourne were still not going anywhere in the middle of last year. And so in the end, I just did those. So that's all the stuff that we did pre. Do you want to know about the stuff we did post?
Next, coming up. That's coming up next. Given that you are running programs and using the book for your business, how have the books helped you gain visibility? And can you say with any certainty that they've helped you secure any business?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, even with the first book, Ego Pharmaceuticals, which went on to become a client of mine, their CEO found out about the book. And the Middle East was Saudi Arabia and the UAE were the first places they'd ever opened their markets up. And the CEO wrote and said, I'd like a copy of your book. And I sent it off. And then a few months later, they came back and engaged me to do a project for their team for the Middle East. And,
wow.
And there is an ongoing relationship there. So that was like one that I can say hands down came directly out of that first book. Look, even out of the second book, people came along to the book launch and became clients off the back of coming to the book launch, which kind of blew my mind. Like we're talking companies turning over kind of $5-6 million, not individuals, people with really serious ambition to go global. I think, so, you can point to examples where you've gained clients directly from the book and people will reference the book directly and say, I read your book and now I want to work with you. And that does happen. But I think more broadly, it gives credibility. When you hand over a business card, that's one thing. But when you hand over a book, it's like a business card with a huge thump. And you can give this to somebody and you say, hey, I wrote this. And like half the time, even if they never crack the cover, and if you believe the stats, 80% of people who get your book will never actually read it. That does not matter. Basically, when you hand over a book that you wrote, it blows their mind because most people, however much they want to, the vast majority of people will actually never exercise enough structure and willpower to sit down and write the thing and then get it published and then market it because it is, honest to God, a huge amount of work.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that I, regularly obviously work with my clients on. We start, obviously, they're really excited about writing their book. And then when I take them through what they're going to need to do to market it and get visibility, and the consistent nature of doing that over a period of time kind of dawns on them that the writing the book's possibly one of the easiest parts of the whole process.
Yeah, and look, the books don't sell themselves. Unless you have to be Stephen King. For most people, your book is not going to sell itself. And, nobody wants to have put in all this work and then to have a garage full of books just moldering away, So for me, the hard work is really, look, writing the book is a great deal of effort. As I said, for me, I love to write. So it's not a hardship, but it's a lot of work to get it right. But the real work starts after, because you have to constantly promote it, but it's worth it. So, at the moment, I do a campaign for Business Beyond Borders about every 8 weeks. So, you can buy it any time if it's on our website, and we'll do social campaigns and so forth. We'll do a targeted email campaign every 8 weeks, and we'll usually do some kind of special offer. Because for me, the goal is people are like, well, how's the book going? And I'm like, well, the book is not primarily made to sell copies. That's a great bonus.
Yeah.
If you want to go to the website and buy a hard copy of the book, I'm not going to tell you no, right? Of course I won't. That's a great plus. But the real aim is to get copies into the hands of as many relevant people as possible. And so that's the thing. You should look at it. If you think about the total cost of writing and publishing a book before you market, you're probably looking at, I don't know, about 25 grand, could be, depending on what level of quality you want to go for. But that is the best 25K you will ever spend, I think.
Yeah. And by the way, everybody, I have not prompted Cynthia to say these things.
I actually didn't even read the questions before we got on this call today. So this is like completely ad lib.
But I think the really interesting thing listening to you, Cynthia, is that you were really clear about the purpose and the goal of your books.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just, I want to write a book. It was, I'm going to write and publish this book because these are the things that I want it to do for me and my business. And having real clarity around that is super, super important.
Yeah. Look, sometimes people say, why don't you write a book about working in Iraq? And I'm like, well, I could. But A, would anybody want to read that book? And secondly, what would I do? It's so much work. I'm not going to write a book just for the heck of it. That kind of book I'd probably give to a publisher because I wouldn't mind to write it. As I mentioned, Jaqui, my husband wants me to write a book on raising bilingual children. I also would not mind to write that, but it's not going to serve any immediate business purpose. So unless I go and set up a consultancy on how to raise bilingual kids, which I have no plans for right now, it's not going to be that useful. So yeah, for me, it's very important to know why you're doing it. If you want to write a book because you have a burning desire to write a book, that is totally fine. But I suggest then it's probably not going to be a book for your business.
Yeah. Really, really interesting. Now, here's a slightly different question for you. Given that you've now done this process twice, what wouldn't you do again?
I would not get 2,000 copies printed straight up. So, when you're very optimistic and you think, 2,000 copies, those will be easy to get rid of, it's a lot less easy than it looks. So I went with a smaller print run. The second time I went with half the size. But the thing is, the second book has broader appeal. And my team are also much better at doing what we do with it now. And so, we're seeing that stock of books go down pretty rapidly. Books go out every single week.
Yeah.
Which is great. But yeah, I would be more conservative. You look at print costs and you're like, oh my gosh, when you do less, it's going to be so expensive per copy. But if you only want to work with 10 companies, and you know who the 10 companies are, well, I'm not saying you print 10 books, but maybe you just print 50 or 100 books. If you say you wanted to target banks or large organizations and you just wanted to put a copy on the desk of each CEO, then you do a print run that matches what you're trying to do. So I think, again, it's really about thinking, well, what am I trying to achieve? And also being aware that when you've written a book, sometimes afterwards you'll go back, and when you've had it for a while and people have given feedback and you've looked at it and lived with it, you think, well, I wish I'd thought, there are things I'm like, how come I didn't write about that? I should have put that in. Or, maybe I should have left this bit out. You can always go back and do a second edition or a third one.
Decision to make around print run and unit cost. So, if you print small print runs, there's a high unit cost. If you print way more, there's a lower unit cost. But it's really trying to find the sweet spot between the two. that I think is always a challenge. And typically the people I work with mostly might print between 250, 500, 750 or 1,000, and typically not much more, but we've developed a pretty clear plan in place for exactly those things. You know, how much do you want for promotion, for selling? What are we going to do with it over a 12 to 15 month period?
Yes. Yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Yeah. Okay, so look, we've got, thank you, Cynthia, so much for that insight about your journey, and, you know, being on the, watching you do your second book was really exciting, and it's great to see. I like to finish these little sessions with a quick quiz, and I know you haven't seen these, so these, you know, not too serious questions. So the first question for you is, how do you read? Are you ebook, print book, or audio book?
Ebook and print book.
Okay. What's your preference?
Probably still print.
Yeah, good girl. Best place for reading: couch, bed, or somewhere else?
Definitely in my bed or in the hammock in the back garden.
Oh, fantastic. And marking books. This is always a big one. Do you fold pages, write in the book, or use Post-it notes?
None of the above. Books are sacred.
Books are sacred.
It's paper only.
There you go. I'm a Post-it note lady myself. What is your reading style? Do you read a few, skip a few, or read from beginning to end?
I read from beginning to end unless I don't find it compelling, in which case I'm fine to dump it at any point along the way and return it to the book.
Okay. I've got a bit of a rule that I'll read a book for 100 pages, and then if I haven't really got into it, I will stop. But I typically read books beginning to end and the whole book.
Yeah.
Outside of business and business reading, are you a fiction or non-fiction reader?
Bit of both. I do like fiction a lot. I grew up without a television, and so, you know, reading books was my television. So there's still a fair bit of that going on. But I do really enjoy biographies, and I really enjoy books on historical themes. So, you know, the Greenwich, you know, the book about the Greenwich Mean Time and Oxford Dictionary and the American Revolution, and I don't know, the Mayflower and all that kind of thing. I really enjoy all those kind of books.
Okay, great. And sharing books, are you a hoarder or a giver?
I have gotten much better at giving them away. So now, you know, I loan them, and if they don't come back, well, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, I'm very loath to share my books, and I put my name in them, and I remember who I've given them to. So last question, writing style, are you Oxford English, Australian English, or US English?
Kind of depends who I'm writing for. Some kind of a blend. I mean, when I'm writing books, often I'm writing books for an international audience, so I'm trying to kind of go down the middle and write something that's accessible for a wide variety of audiences, but I will not spell analyze with a Z, put it that way.
Yeah, I call that the S versus Z discussion, and I'm definitely an S lady, and also I like to use the letter U when I spell things.
Yes, me too.
But it's a very, very particular thing. Cynthia, we've come to the end now of our author interview. One last question for you. Would you recommend that somebody who's in a business, setting up a business or a consultancy, would you recommend that they go through the process of writing, self-publishing their own business book?
Yeah, look, if you've got something worth saying, I think there is no better way of sharing that with the world and just demonstrating your authority in the space than writing a book. So for me, that would be a big yes.
There you go. Cynthia, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Donna's going to put up on the screen, thank you for those who put up comments already. We'll make sure that we'll get Cynthia's books to you if you are smart enough to do that, and they're both seriously good books. And we've put up Cynthia's details. If you know somebody who wants to expand internationally, Cynthia is your lady. And if you are thinking about writing or self-publishing your own book, you should pick up the phone or send an email to me, and Donna has shared those as well. So thank you, everybody, for putting up with my first LinkedIn Live. I think we mostly got through it. So appreciate your time. Have a really good rest of your afternoon, and look forward to seeing you in the book world in some way, shape or form. Good afternoon.